Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. My name is Joey. There's been a lot of talk about the main event of UFC 265, which takes place on August 7th. And right now, the only big fight, or not even big fight, title fight that's announced for the card is Amanda Nunes defending her bantamweight title against Juliana Pena. But to be honest, we all know that's not a real main event. That's not going to sell any tickets. That's not going to sell any pay-per-views. I like seeing Amanda Nunes fight, and this is a fight that I'm more interested in for her. But by no means is this drawing anybody to purchase the pay per view. So there's been some talk of what will be the main event. So the most logical person to fight on the card right now is Francis Ngannou, the heavyweight champion. So there was already some talk of Francis Ngannou defending his belt on the June 12th card, which is UFC 263. That was a while ago, but now obviously they found their main event in Israel Adesanya versus Marvin Vettori. So basically now it's a foregone conclusion that Francis Ngannou will be defending his belt on that UFC 265 main event spot. And the next logical question is, who is he fighting at 265? And obviously we all know pretty much there's two options. It's either Derrick Lewis or Jon Jones. Now we're going to get to that in a minute. But first, let me play you this clip of Dana White. He did an interview at UFC Vegas 27 and basically confirms that Francis Ngannou will be the main event of UFC 265. So go ahead and check that out.
UFC 265, August 7th, we have Amanda Nunes taking on Juliana Pena, but no main event. Why? Are you saving that for Francis, perhaps?
Perhaps. We're working on some things right now. And yes, that's one of the fights we're working on.
So as you can see in that clip, Dana White confirms that he's working on a fight for Francis Ngannou for the main event of UFC 265. So I've already mentioned before, who is he going to defend his belt against? And there's really two options. It's Derrick Lewis versus Jon Jones. And don't get me wrong, Derrick Lewis 100% deserves a title shot. He's on a 4-fight win streak. But Jon Jones is arguably the consensus GOAT of MMA. There's been speculation for years and intrigue for years about him moving up to heavyweight. And, we all know the story. Jon Jones last fought in February of 2020 against Dominic Reyes in a super close fight. After the fight, there was some negotiating issues. Then eventually Jon Jones says, well, I'm relinquishing the belt and I'm moving to heavyweight. My guess is and we'll get into it later in this video, he was thinking, well, if I go to heavyweight, which most people have wanted for years and people are super intrigued about that, then I'll probably get a bump in pay. So if there's any question of if Dana White's going to try to make the Jon Jones fight or not, check out this clip.
UFC fans who want to watch Jon Jones fight.
Yeah, I've absolutely moved on. Listen, I put on fights every Saturday. We have a window where we try to build some fights and make some things happen. If the fights don't happen within that window, we move on. And realistically, I've been saying it since the beginning. Derrick Lewis is the guy who should be getting this title shot. This is the guy that's, beat Francis Ngannou. He's next in line. He's coming off great performances. And that's a wrap.
So as you can see in that TMZ clip, Dana says they have moved on from the possibility of making Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones, which in my opinion is absolutely tragic. I am so intrigued in Jon Jones at heavyweight. To be honest, I would tune in to any pay-per-view with him main eventing against any other heavyweight, to be honest. It doesn't even have to be for the belt. But Jones versus Ngannou is just so intriguing to me. And I'm still going to hold out a little bit of hope because if you're a hardcore MMA fan and you've listened to Dana talk for years upon years, a lot of the times what he says ends up being the opposite happening. And that may be what happens in this case. We've seen him, not too long ago saying Rose doesn't want the Weili Zhang fight. And look what happened there. Eventually the fight got made. This is just some public negotiating by Dana White trying to back Jon Jones in the corner. He may just go with Derrick Lewis. That's a viable option without a doubt. Derrick Lewis is a popular fighter. He's earned his shot at heavyweight, which I'm a little bit of a hypocrite in this case because I'm always talking about championship merit. And with Lewis, you have a guy who's on a 4-fight win streak at heavyweight. And Jones, you have a guy who's never fought at heavyweight. And I'm campaigning for him to get a title shot. I just love the fight so much. And I think this is one of those gray areas where Jones arguably deserves it. And I would love to see him fight. So There's a chance that the Jones fight still happens, but it's very, very slim in my opinion. And in case it's not very clear what Dana White was saying in that TMZ interview, this is what he's had to say at UFC 262, the post-fight presser, about the whole Ngannou Lewis Jones situation. So listen to this.
Derrick Lewis is back here doing a guest fighter scrum. He's saying he was hoping to make the fight against Francis officially official. Have you had an opportunity to talk to him while you're in Houston?
Ask me that question again.
Derrick Lewis is back here saying he was hoping that his fight against Francis would become official, and he was hoping to talk to you at some point. Have you had a chance?
Yeah. No, listen, Derrick Lewis is next in line. He's the guy who deserves the shot at the heavyweight championship. And yes, we will get that fight done. And, we're not talking about it yet because it's probably not going to be till mid or late August. So, yeah.
And as of right now, the winner would probably still get Stipe, unless this Jon Jones situation.
Yeah, well, Jon made it very clear he won't fight Stipe. So, yeah.
So there you go. Dana White, again, confirming that Derrick Lewis will be next. But again, that's some public negotiating. Now, I believe they probably will skip over Jones just because Dana does not like to ever give in to fighter demands. But the real question is, what is Jones asking for that's so ridiculous, and why is he asking for it? Now, Jones went on Steve-O's podcast and did an interview, and what's crazy is he gave some great insight into what he's asking for from the UFC and why he's asking for it. It's super honest and real. And it was actually really nice to see. And I think, Steve-O did a great job in this interview getting information out of Jones. So I wanted to show you guys that clip. So here it is. Check out Jon Jones talking about why he wants more money against Ngannou.
Agree. I think that I'm even more beatable as a heavyweight. And that's why I went to Dana White looking for a raise. Daniel Cormier got a raise when he went heavyweight. I was looking for a raise to go heavyweight. Francis Ngannou is scary.
Yeah, he is.
There's a big chance that he could break my jaw, and
Sure.
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that as a fighter. I've whooped enough ass that if someone eventually gets me, then we all have our day. I'm okay with that. But I think that should come with an increase of pay. I think
What about
me at heavyweight, the pay-per-view numbers are going to go up inevitably. More people are going to watch. But
profit?
what I wanted was just the guarantee up front to go up a bit, because
So there you go. There's Jon Jones telling it for himself in a refreshingly honest interview on the Steve-O podcast, which was crazy to hear. With MMA fighters, you have, at least in the public eye, you have this disillusioned confidence a lot of the times where, I'll destroy anybody, anywhere, anytime. And it was very, refreshing to hear Jones say, I am more beatable at heavyweight. And this goes to attest to Jon Jones' fight IQ. I think he has the best fight IQ in the whole game. And he's a realist. He looks at Francis Ngannou, and he knows if I fight Ngannou for 5 rounds and he lands one punch on my chin, there's a chance that I go to sleep. And he even says it in there. I could get my jaw broke, and I'm okay with that. But it should come with an increase in pay. And I don't know any of the specific numbers, but without a doubt, if Jon Jones is going up to fight Francis Ngannou, there should be an increase in pay. And also what he talks about in the tail end of there is he wanted more upfront money. So a lot of the way, fighters' contracts are structured is, first off, there's a show up money, so show money. So let's just say, $1 million, just for an example. Then there's win money, which is usually double what the show money is. So you get paid $1 million to show up, then you get paid $1 million to win. Then for notable draws or champions, you get pay-per-view points. So for every, pay-per-view buy, let's say over 500,000 or whatever, just as an example, you get $1 for every pay-per-view that's sold. And basically what Jones is saying, instead of all that, just give me upfront money. And a lot of fighters have done this before. Anderson Silva has gotten it before. Countless other guys have gotten it before, where basically no win money, no pay-per-view points, and I don't know if that's specifically what he's asking for, but I just want a flat rate. Pay me, X million to show up and fight, win or lose, regardless of how the pay-per-view sells. And I really think the UFC should, work with Jon Jones in some way, because I think Jones versus Ngannou is so much bigger than Ngannou versus Lewis. I mean, we've all seen that first Ngannou versus Lewis fight, and it was terrible. That's not to say the second fight can't be amazing, but the intrigue level on a Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones fight is just so much more massive, in my opinion. I think, it would sell so many more pay-per-views, and I would just love to see it, but who knows what's going to happen. Um, in this next clip from the same podcast that Jon Jones did, he talks about, like, if I can't get what I want from the UFC, what are my other options? And this is really interesting to hear a fighter say, because Jones is in the luxurious position to be able to say this type of stuff. Other smaller fighters who are lesser paid, they're not allowed to speak out on this type of stuff because the UFC can just cut them and then they're screwed. There's very few places to go. But check out this clip.
Are you going to make money going to Bellator?
Well, yeah, that's the most messed up thing about my situation currently is in any other profession, if you're unhappy with the way you're being treated or the way, you're being paid or whatever, you can just, take your shit and leave and go to the next boss and see if they value you more. And in my situation, I would be forced to retire from fighting completely unless I wanted to coach or own a gym.
So there you hear from Jon Jones. What are his options if the UFC does not, work with him and they cannot get a deal? And he basically has no options. The UFC contract will be there no matter what he does. We've seen it in the past. Even if he retires, the contract is frozen. He owes the UFC X amount of fights. He signed the contract. And it's just crazy to see that. And that's a topic for a whole nother video about, the potential monopoly that the UFC has over the fighters. But there is some other organizations. But there's no way that the UFC would ever cut Jon Jones and let him go fight anywhere else. He's considered their greatest of all time. Nobody wants to see Jon Jones over in Bellator. Not to say it wouldn't sell, but what I'm saying is nobody in the UFC, basically they're saying you either fight for us or you fight for no one. And I hope that they somehow work this out, no matter if it's in, this year or in the future, because Jon Jones has already sat out for almost a year and a half. And, regardless if you like the guy or not, I think everybody loves seeing him fight. This next clip is really talking about, is the UFC really going to budge at all?
The fact that the UFC wasn't willing to budge at all. They didn't want to talk about, hey, listen, let's pay you a little, let's enhance this, let's make this. There was zero negotiation. Whether you go heavyweight next, whether you fight Dominic Reyes next, whether you fight Jan Blachowicz next, you were going to get paid the same amount. And that's what made me retire, because I just...
So there you go. You heard it from Jones himself. Whether he fights Francis Ngannou next, whether he fights Jan Blachowicz next, whether he fights Dominic Reyes next, the UFC says, we'll pay you the same no matter what, which is absolutely insanity, in my opinion. Some of those fights, the Ngannou fight is just exponentially bigger and would sell so much more. And also, I think, forget that I sound like I'm campaigning for Jones here. I'm campaigning in it for selfish reasons. I don't think, and I want people to comment in the comment section and let me know, are you dying to see Ngannou versus Lewis, or would you much prefer Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones? Because I know which side I'm on. And, regardless, whether Jones deserves more money or not, for selfish reasons, that's the fight that I want to see. And I think that fight would get a lot of people excited. I think that fight would do massive numbers. And it's crazy that the UFC is willing to say, okay, well, if you fight Yan, you get the same amount. You fight Dominic Reyes, you get the same amount. You fight Francis, you get the same amount. It's just disturbing. And I don't know what the conclusion of this UFC versus Jon Jones saga will be, but it doesn't look like either side is willing to budge. Listen to this other clip from Jon Jones from the same Steve-O podcast, whether or not, he's willing to budge. Check it out.
Okay.
No, I don't want to fight soon. I don't want to fight soon. I have no interest in fighting in the UFC until I get paid what I believe I'm worth. And a lot of fans, like Steve-O, like just said, will continue to watch the UFC and support the UFC, and I have no problem with that. I just ordered the last pay-per-view myself.
Now, on the
but I think it's really
question,
powerful when you stand up for what you believe is right. And I think that eventually the UFC will realize that they're being stubborn. They'll realize that they do have a special athlete in myself, and I think they'll realize. I think they'll eventually meet me halfway.
So guys, do me a favor, if you haven't already, click the like button, make sure you subscribe, and make sure you turn on notifications. I really appreciate it. In that clip, you see Jon Jones just seems like he's not willing to give in to the UFC and to Dana White. And I really think one of the main problems with this whole situation, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I don't know anything, but the fact that Jones took the negotiations public, we've seen in the past with Dana and the UFC, it's almost like now they're stubborn. No matter what, we're not going to lose a public battle with one of our fighters. And, he did this before. I'm not talking about specifically this interview. I'm talking about, constantly tweeting about this or that. The UFC needs to pay him more. And, I'm with him. I'm with him on the fighter pay issue. But maybe that's not the right way to achieve it. He's recently fired his manager, Melky Kawa. Well, not fired. They cut ties with each other. Fired, cut ties, same shit to me. But he says, he's not going to fight until he gets paid what he thinks he's worth. And Jon Jones is in a very unique position. He has already cemented his legacy. He's already proven that he's one of the best in the world. And he's made a lot of money. So he has the resources to sit out and not fight and potentially retire if the UFC isn't willing to pay him what he deems he's worth. I think we will see Jon Jones in the cage again. I don't know if it'll be against Francis Ngannou. I believe it will be at heavyweight. But eventually there has to be some give from either Jon Jones or the UFC. Meet in the middle at some point in time and make one of these massive fights happen. Because for me personally, as badly as I want to see Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, I would love to see Jon Jones versus any heavyweight. Jon Jones versus Derrick Lewis. Jon Jones versus Cyril Gane. I would love to see any of those matchups. And the UFC knows that more people would be willing to buy that. So the extra money that they would depart by paying Jones a little bit extra, they would make up more in the profit of the fight itself because it would sell more than anything else that they could do. I believe this is the biggest fight could be made in UFC history, Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, and I just don't get why the UFC can't find a way to make it happen. And again, I don't know the specific numbers. I'm just dying to see this fight, and I just feel like regardless of what he wants, they have to be making more profit going with Jones than anybody else, including Lewis. But that being said, I think the main event of UFC 265 will probably be Francis Ngannou versus Derrick Lewis. And maybe they'll get something worked out after the fact. Dana has already alluded to Jon Jones versus Stipe, but I think that's utter bullshit. I think Dana's bluffing on that. If he sees Jon Jones at heavyweight, he wants Jon Jones fighting for the title. That's going to make the UFC the most money. And so I just really think he's bluffing. And for a guy who's supposed to be promoting guys, he does an awful lot of time trashing them. And I don't know, if that helps them in the long run because of money issues. But you just hate to see it. And maybe he's in the right as well. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes? I don't. I just know I'm dying to see this fight. So there you go. That's an update on the Jon Jones situation. There you go. The main event for UFC 265. Thank you so much for watching my video. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you turn on notifications. And I'll see you in the next video.